냐지 쳔보 쏘던 힘이 정도는 뭐는 쳔보가 비었다. 다크르다는 전도 슈르마도 돈바 투지잖아 기시험도 내전 워서는 이정감선 자우 투지션도 일라 The
answer past profound and wonderful dharmas difficult to encounter in billions of aeons. I now see it, here to receive and uphold it. I vow to fathom the Tathagata's true meaning. To liberate all beings, let's generate the supreme bodhicitta. Let us now continue with our class on the Surangama Sutra. Recently, we've been listening into the conversations between the Buddha and Ananda in order to let the Great Assembly as well as Ananda to understand the nature of the six sense organs, the six roots. The Buddha particularly demonstrated the example or demonstrated a particular action by using the flowered cloth, this brocade, and the Buddha tied it 6 times. In our last class, the Buddha kept on asking, we've learned that the Buddha kept on asking Ananda as well as the assembly that whether the first knot is the 6th knot. The brocade definitely is of the same thing. It is of the same entity. However, the 6 knots are not the same knots. The 6 knots are different in the entities. So that's the example the Buddha had given. Sometimes in the Vajrayana teachings, there are various kinds of demonstrations given by the Lama. Sometimes it is of the crystal ball to let us see, or sometimes a taste of the Amrita, sometimes to look at various kinds of pictures of the consort, sometimes hearing some kinds of sound, sometimes a tactile sensation, rough or smooth. Those are all the methods to point to the nature of our mind. Those are simply a representation or a demonstration. The ones with sharp capacity, by relying on those methods, would be able to recognize their minds. But for the ones with dull capacity, they would be able to contemplate upon those kinds of examples, and then would be able to attain certain kinds of recognition of their minds or the truth of phenomena. Now, let's continue to look at the sutra over here. The Buddha said to Ananda, "You certainly dislike these 6 knots and would like there to be just one cloth. But how can that be done?" The Buddha says that, well, you really don't like this 6 knots, isn't it? You wish that it is not 6 knots anymore. You wish it would become just one knot or one cloth. Is that true? You wish it would be of one entity. Ananda at this point couldn't really reply, because you can't really say that the 6 knots are of one entity or of other entities, because from the appearance, the 6 knots are of different entities, just like our 6 sense organs. But in its actuality, the functions and then the processing characteristics, they are of different entities. They're not of one entity. However, the 6 roots, the nature of the 6 roots are of one entity. And then Ananda replied to the Buddha by saying that as long as these knots remain, there will be grounds for arguments about what is and what is not. Their very existence will lead to such distinctions as this knot not being that knot and that knot not being this one. Ananda replied saying that, well, there will be the arguments over what is and what is not. It will be difficult to clarify. I can't say that this is of one entity or of other entities. There will be constant arguments over over that. Also, it is natural to have the arguments over this knot is not that knot and that knot is not this knot. That's easy to understand. After having 6 knots, you know that the first one is not the 6th one and 6th one is not the first one either. After making such observation, as long as there are different knots on this particular brocade, then the arguments of what is and what is not will be continuously a debating topic. There is no way to pacify such arguments. Ananda probably also feels that if there is only one brocade and there are different knots, I cannot really give answers of it. And in principle, I would very much wish that all the knots are untied. Wouldn't that be wonderful? We would have no arguments anymore. And then Ananda continued to say that, but if on this day the thus come one unties them all so that no knots remains, then there will be no this and no that. There will be not even something called one. How much the less can there be 6? Ananda really asked excellent questions, and he's dared to ask those questions more so than the other disciples, because the other disciples would be fearing of the magnificence of the Buddha. But Ananda, being a relative of the Buddha, he dares to ask those questions. Ananda over here says that, well, if the world-honored one could unknot all of the 6, that would be untie all of the 6 knots, that would be the best. If there is no knots, then it solves the problems. If there is no knot, then there is no more questions of this and that. No concepts of the first knot, the second knot, and the sixth, all the way till the 6th knot. If there is no knot, then there is no question of the first knot. If there is no first knot, how could there be the 6th knot? Because in order to have the 6th knot, you have to have the 1st, the 2nd, and 3rd, and 4th, all the way to the 5th, and then you can have the 6th knot. So Ananda says that, wouldn't that be better if there is no knot? Or to untie all of them. That would be the best. This example indirectly points to that it would be the best not to have the roots. If we don't have the first root, then how could we have the 6th root? If we do not have the 6 roots, we would no longer be dwelling in the 6 realms. So Ananda at that point really want to seize all the 6 roots, the 6 sense organs. All of us, each of us, also dwell in samsara because of the 6 roots. So this is a question that is very relevant to every one of us. But sometimes I do have to say that to have the perfect 6 roots, to be perfectly endowed with the 6 roots, are really wonderful, because after having the 6 roots, we can enjoy the Mahayana Dharma teaching. If we can't see through our eyes, can't hear through our ears, then how could we enjoy the Dharma teachings? Also, in order to live in this world, we need the roots of the tongue of the body. Without the 6 roots, we won't have the opportunities to enjoy the Mahayana teachings. Some people tend to have more of a dull roots, and they would look here and there, especially during the presentation time after class. Not sure if they're just pretending it, or maybe they just have that look. During our post-class presentation time and discussion time, each of us would have the opportunity to talk and discuss the Dharma. But maybe because everyone's memory and their eloquence are different and their roots have different capacities, so we can see that people would react differently during that period of time. But I think in general, having the capacity to receive the Mahayana Dharma teachings, the nectar-like Dharma teachings, is so crucial to all of us. When we look around us, there are so many handicapped people that do not have the perfect endowments of the roots, then it definitely creates lots of inconvenience. And at that time, the Buddha said, when the six are untied, the one is gone. It is of the same meaning. It is to say that if the six roots are resolved, if the roots are not to be produced initially, then there is no production of the first root. If the first root is not produced, then there is no way for the sixth root to be produced. If the six roots are all liberated, then there is no way for the first root, for one root, to be existent. It is definitely liberated at the same time. If we were to use the terminology of Mahāti, if one root is self-liberated, then all the other roots are naturally, spontaneously liberated as well. And then the Buddha continued to say that because from beginningless time your mind and nature have been made wild and rebellious, you have produced a false knowledge and views. This falseness continues to arise without respite, and the wariness of these views bring about objective dust. The Buddha points out that Ananda, all the sentient beings, do not attain liberation that easily. Why is that? Because the perfect, pure, and luminous nature, though it is undefiled, it is luminous and pure, but because from beginningless time, the mind has been defiled and has been in this falseness, been veiled by this falseness. Because of that, all kinds of wild and rebelliousness would manifest. It is similar to Yajnadatta having sickness, having this madness. All of a sudden, all kinds of illusions, madness would manifest in front of him, and nothing could stop it. If you were to find a reason, it's difficult to find a reason. Similarly, the sentient beings from beginningless time, the mind and nature have been made wild and rebellious, which then induced in falseness and produced those false knowledge and views. And because of that, all kinds of the objective dust, the adventitious dusts would manifest. That includes the objective form, sound, smell, taste, and so on. According to the Chinese commentary, there are different masters who would explain the six knots into various kinds of that refers to different kinds of knots, such as the knots of movements, of stillness, of cessation. There are different kinds of knots. Also, the 5 aggregates that could correspond to those as well. But if we were to explain it, we can understand that the 6 roots, in order to untie the knots of the 6 roots, it's not that easy, because it is because of the beginningless habitual tendencies. It is so deeply rooted. It is not it is not easy to completely eradicate it right away, especially for all of us that are dwelling in samsara. I think this is very clear. We see the mountain as mountain, rivers as rivers. All of those are very solid to us. We can talk about, in theory, that they do not exist, but they do appear in front of us. And then the Buddha continued to give an example. He said that it is just like strange flowers appear when your eyes grow weary of staring. They arise at random without any cause within this tranquil, essential brightness. Whenever we stare into the space, after staring for a long time, the eyes would grow tired and weary, and then all of a sudden, all kinds of forms would appear in the space, of flowers, hair, whatever they may be. However, in the essence of seeing, that is pure, that is undefiled, that is bright luminosity, that is the essence of it. And it is only by some temporary causes and conditions all kinds of forms would manifest. It is only when people get eye illness or after the eyes grow weary, you would start to see all kinds of falseness. And then the Buddha continued to say that everything in the world, the mountains, the rivers, the great earth, as well as birth, death, and nirvana, is all just a strange weariness, the upside-down appearance of flowers. All of the phenomenal world, the mountains, rivers, ground, or the samsara, and the impure, defiled conditions, defiled dharma, as well as the pure, undefiled dharma, that is nirvana, all of those stated above, in fact, are simply the manifestations of falseness, of our habitual tendencies, of this upside-down falseness. After studying Surangama Sutra, we need to know that whatever we see, hear, whatever we perceive, all of those manifestations are no other than empty flowers. They are without any self-existence. Of course, we understand it from the theory, the theory aspect. However, we need to make the observation. We cannot just say that because the Buddha said so, therefore I believe it. Rather, you need to make the observation with your own wisdom, with your own analysis. At the point when you understand that even in the conventional world, even in the conventional sense, those things do not uphold the nature of existence, then that is certainty. Many of you probably feel that, oh, this is simply a statement of Buddhism. Because I am a Buddhist, therefore I have to follow this teaching, otherwise I am a terrible disciple. So, okay, I will agree that things do not exist in the conventional sense. That is not the proper way of being a Buddhist. You should really delve into the actual teachings, and you should come to the realization and insight and understanding of emptiness, of luminosity. You would definitely be able to do so after stepping into the more profundities of study and contemplation. You would naturally understand that, especially when it comes to the Vajrayana teachings. All of those profound teachings can be understood if you persistently study and contemplate and practice upon it, and you would be able to understand it. And then at that time, I think you can be very proud of yourself of being a Buddhist. And then at this time, Ananda started asking, this weariness is the same as knots. So such kinds of falseness are just the same as the knots. How do we untie them then? what are the methods to untie the knots? Or how do we untie all of the false appearances? How do we extinguish those false appearances? What are the methods then? Then the thus come one took hold of the knotted cloth and pulled on its left and asked Ananda, is this the way to untie it? Since the Buddha was holding the brocade that has the 6 knots on it, and then the Buddha tucked the brocade to the left end, and then while tucking it, while pulling it, the Buddha asked Ananda, saying that, is this the way to untie it? Of course, Ananda is very smart, and he said that that's not the way to untie it, because the more you pull it, the more tight it is. If you were to tuck it further, it's going to be more tightened. It will get harder and harder to untie those knots. And then the Buddha continued to ask. Then with his hand, he pulled on the right end and again asked Ananda, is this a way to untie it? Then, with the world-honored one's hand, he pulled on the right end and then asked Ananda, saying that, in this way, would I be able to untie it? Ananda said, no, that's not possible. If you were to do that, it's just going to get tighter and tighter. It's not possible. The world-honored one then said that, now I have pulled it to the left and right with my hand and still have not been able to undo them. I am not able to untie this knot by tucking it to the left or the right. Ananda also acknowledged that. The Buddha then said that, well, what method do you, Ananda, propose for untying them? Do you have a skillful means, a method to untie the knots? To untie the 6 knots? Ananda then told Ananda then said to the Buddha, saying that, world-honored one, you must untie the knots from their center. Then they will become undone. They will be untied. Ananda said that, well, this is simple. You can just untie it by wiggling it from the center. I'm sure you're experienced with that too, how to untie the knot. According to the commentary, it says that tucking to the left points to the graspings of the worldly beings, because the worldly beings would hold on to existence. And then there are the ones that would tuck to the right, which points to the practitioners of the 2 yanas, because they hold on to emptiness. Either way, those beings would not be able to attain full liberation. Of course, the 2 types of views represents the view of externalism and nihilism. According to the ornament of Madhyamika, it says that the worldly beings often think that everything is existent. So that is more close to the extreme of externalism. And then the two yanas, the practitioners of the two yanas, would think that everything is of empty. So it's more easy to fall into the extreme of nihilism. So if you were to fall into either of the two extremes, you would not be able to attain liberation. And then after Ananda asked this question, the Buddha said to Ananda, so it is. So it is. If you want to get them undone, you have to untie them from the center. If you untie it from the center, then you have the opportunity to untie the knot, which refers to the middle way. The middle way of not falling into either of the extremes of externalism nor of the nihilism. It is not to abide on the two extremes nor in the middle either. That is the true nature of all phenomena. According to the Ranakutta Sutra, it says that existence is one extreme, non-existence is another extreme. In the middle of existence and non-existence, it is of no form, no shape, no ignorance, nor non-ignorance. That is the middle way. I can't remember exactly the terms in the Tibetan language anymore, but anyways, at least you can't speak Tibetan anyways. And you probably would feel that I did a great job memorizing it and reciting it. There are lots of people that would use the jargons and the terminologies to fool the others. That's not very professional. But this is just an exception, because whenever I quote from the other teachings, I usually would quote quite accurately in Tibetan. So do not misunderstand my intention over here. And then the Buddha started to speak of the Madhyamika teachings and the causes and conditions. The Buddha says that, Ananda, the Buddha Dharma explained arises from causes and conditions. But this is not to grasp at mixing and uniting of coarse appearance in the world. The Buddha started to talk about the causes and conditions of Madhyamika. So he would use the example to talk about not to fall into the two extremes. When the Buddha talks about causes and conditions, we've studied the praises of dependent arising as well as the Madhyamika teachings. I think we should know that. This is really the core philosophy of the Buddha's teaching. It is dependent arising. Many great masters also pointed out that none of any beings in this world had expounded the teaching of dependent arising as the Buddha had. So the Buddha also stated that the core of my Dharma teaching is the dependent arising because of the... and over here it says that this dependent arising is not to grasp at mixing and uniting of course and appearance in this world. He says that usually people would think that it is of a mixing and uniting of the coarse forms or coarse appearance. But those are really, really simple. And that is why some people would say that, the causes and conditions and the dependent arising according to Buddhism is like planting a seed, and then it comes to fruition. It becomes all kinds of parts of the plants, such as roots and stems and leaves and flowers, and then fruition. Well, it is a very coarse aspect of causes and conditions and dependent arising. We can say that when we were young, and then we grow up, and then we reach the time of youth, and then the mid-age, and then seniors, and then we would die. So that is also part of causes and conditions. But those kinds of causes and conditions are not the profound causes conditions that the Buddha is referring to over here. Those are simply the very rough and very coarse aspect of the dependent arising. Because even the worldly beings understands those kinds of coarse causes conditions. But the Buddha over here states that the thus come one understands all worldly and world transcending dharmas and knows their fundamental causes and what conditions bring them into becoming. So, for example, as the sentient beings, the animate and inanimate world, our true nature, that is the Buddha nature, with causes and conditions, it slowly manifests into the impure world, for example. If we were to recognize the true nature of it, we would be able to attain certain fruitions. Those are quite profound and subtle. It is with the profound and subtle causes and conditions that is the kinds of dependent arising that the Tathagatas are talking about. It is not some of the very simple causes and conditions that by planting a seed, you will reap the fruition that's associated with seeds. For those, even a biologist would understand that. Even the ones who had never studied science or philosophy, even farmers would understand if you were to plant the seeds of barley, you will reap barley. These kinds of concepts, the farmers and those herdsmen knows them very well. The worldly beings often would talk about planting the seed of melons, you would reap melons, and planting the seeds of beans, you would reap beans. I think I've told you the story of my teacher who was a deep believer of dialectic materialism. My teacher didn't like me back then, and he would stare at me and says that by planting the seed of melon, you would reap melon. Planting seeds of beans, you would reap beans. Those kinds of opinions and philosophy is not anything religious, and one should not be superstitious about this. And then he would have kept on staring at me out of the whole crowd and to say that, well, there are some of you who's not believing in science completely. So in terms of nurturing the students, we have to nurture their mind. Anyhow, over here it points that the causes and conditions that it refers to over here is very profound and very subtle. We need to understand it. And then in the sutra, it continued to say that this is so to the extent that I know how many drops of rain fall in as many worlds away from here as there are dust motes in the Ganges. The same is true for all things you can see, why the pine is straight, why the brambles are twisted, why the goose is white, and why the crow is black. I understand the reasons. The Buddha over here specifically pointed out those kinds of phenomena, such as the numbers of raindrops that fall down from the space and fall into the different worlds, as many as the sands of Ganges rivers. Also, the appearances that we see, we can see that the pines are very straight, and the Buddha knows why it is straight. And some of the other woods may be quite crooked, and the Buddha knows why they are crooked. Also, the goose and the Chinese translation is the swan. Why the swans are white but crows are black? All of those causes and conditions are completely known by the Das Come One. In the extensive biography of the Shakyamuni Buddha, I believe there was a story talking about a rishi lived in a forest for 12 years. He counted the numbers of the leaves in that forest. But then later, there came another rishi. At the time of looking at the forest, he knows right away of the number numbers of leaves there because they were having a competition. So it turned out the two rishis, the one that saw and knew how many leaves were there in the forest, was the previous life of Shakyamuni Buddha, and the other one that counted the leaves was the previous life of Shariputra. We don't, of course, we know the manifestations of trees, of water drops, of this and that, but we don't know the causes and conditions to it. We don't know the more subtle and profound causes to it. We only know that, sure, the virtuous seeds would lead to virtuous fruition and vice would lead to vice. But only the Buddha knows that all the phenomena are empty, and our mind, our nature of mind is Tathagata is the Buddha nature, and every sentient being has this Buddha nature. All of these kinds of teachings, we can understand it conceptually with our dualistic thoughts or through inference, but we do not know the subtleties and profundities within this. When it comes to whether the reasons behind why the swans are white and the crows are black, we don't really know that. It is associated with some causes and conditions for sure. Maybe that's why the clothing of doctors are of white, because it signifies some virtue. Recently I saw some news that a lot of people in France was on the street and they were having certain kinds of demonstrations, and then some of the police that was wearing black clothing started beating them up. So sometimes the colors signify certain tendencies and those causes and conditions that we don't know, but the Buddha knows. And then to continue, the Buddha said that therefore, Ananda, you can select whichever one of the 6 sense organs you wish. If the knots of the sense organs are removed, then the defiling appearances disappear of themselves. We need to find one particular sense organ so that you can untie the knots of those sense organs. And at those times the sense organs are removed, the defiling appearances disappear of themselves. All false ceases to be. If that is not true, what do you expect in addition to it? In the next part, the Buddha started to talk about the arhats and the bodhisattvas, and then the Buddha will introduce out of which defiling object or which consciousness those noble ones had attained realization. So the Buddha said to Ananda, you need to also pick one sense organ to work on so that you can attain realization. If the knots of the sense organs are removed, then the defiling appearances disappear of themselves. At that time, one would have attained the highest level of realization. And then the Buddha started giving the systematic steps of untying those knots through an example. The Buddha then told Ananda by saying that, Ananda, I now ask you, can the 6 knots in the cloth of the layered flowers be untied simultaneously and released all at once? The Buddha says that, well, the flowered cloth that's being offered to the Buddha, this flower layered cloth, has been tied in 6 knots. Is it possible to untie all of them at once? Can those ties be simultaneously released? This is a question. And then Ananda said that, no, world-honored one. What's the pronunciation of no? The no in Chinese language. Sometimes it is pronounced this way and sometimes that way, right? The two old monks, one said yes, both ways work, and the other one said no, that's not possible.
什么？哦，真悟空行全部接触了，好吗？哦，那个老菩萨说是偷换概念、偷换逻辑，不对，是吧？好嘛，你们这些老菩萨们还是厉害啊！好，就是那就我们看看佛陀怎么说的啊。然后这个就阿难就是说是不。
Ananda then over here says that no, world honored one, the knots were originally made one at a time. Now they must be untied one at a time. The substance of the 6 knots is the same, but they were not made simultaneously. And so now, when it is time to release them, how can they be untied simultaneously? Ananda's reply is that at the time of tying those knots, it was one at a time. It was not tied simultaneously. Unlike maybe there are people, for example, the Qigong masters would be able to do it really quickly by blowing some air. But over here, the Buddha made those knots one by one. So at the time of releasing those knots, you need to release it one by one. It is not possible to simultaneously release all of them. Though the nature of the knots are of one entity, that means the brocade is of one entity, but from the knots perspective, they're of different knots. So to release the different knots, it cannot be simultaneously released. So you have to release them one by one. That is simply a natural law. You cannot you cannot use a false logic to apply in this. And then the Buddha over here replied by saying that releasing the 6 sense organs is the same way. He said that, well, if you cannot simultaneously release the 6 knots, then releasing the 6 sense organs is the same way. Majority of us would still need to release the 6 organs one by one, just like Ananda. And maybe people with the capacity of Vajrayana would be able to release all of the 6 knots at one time, simultaneously, would be able to attain realization. And then the Buddha continued to say that when the sense organs begin to release, one realizes the emptiness of people first. So at the time of slowly attain understanding, by releasing one root out of the 6, at first one should practice the emptiness of self. At the time of understanding the emptiness of self, then one would be able to attain freedom. So at first, it is to give teachings of the emptiness of self to the Shravakas and Pratikas. After one has a full realization of emptiness of self, then the teachings of selflessness of phenomena can be slowly realized. In the Hinayana, usually we would say that the Hinayana, the noble ones of the Hinayana had already come to realization of selflessness of self, as well as a partial selflessness of phenomena. And then slowly and slowly by steps, they would be able to attain realization. When the nature of that emptiness is fully understood, then one is released from dharmas. Once one is freed from dharmas, then neither kind of emptiness will arise. This is called the patience with no production attained by bodhisattvas by means of samadhi. At this time of attaining the realization of emptiness of self and phenomena, then even emptiness cannot be produced. At that time, it is called the bodhisattva. Upon receiving the Buddha's instruction, Ananda and the great assembly gained wisdom and awareness that was perfectly penetrating and free of doubt and delusion. After receiving this teaching from the great compassionate Buddha, Ananda and the great assembly attained full penetration, perfect penetration, and free from doubt and delusion. In the sutra, it says, all at once they placed their palms together, bowed at the Buddha's feet, and they said to the Buddha, today our bodies and minds are illuminated, and we're happy, free from obstruction. All at once, the great Sangha bowed at the feet of the Buddha and stated in such a way, saying that all of us indeed had received the teaching given by the Buddha. All of our minds and heart had attained undefiled happiness, and we feel this pure and clarity, the happiness that is without any obscurations, any graspings. I think some Dharma teachers, after giving you Dharma teachings, or the Dharma teaching through a class, through a book, through a particular Dharma teaching that benefited you in such a way, your doubts and confusions are completely alleviated and unfettered in such a way. Your mind stream would completely transform from being deluded with all kinds of afflictions and being fettered by all kinds of conceptual thoughts. At the time of receiving the wonderful Dharma, if your mind can merge into the Dharma, if you can embody the Dharma, and if Dharma can merge into your mind stream, then slowly your actions and your view will be in accordance with the Dharma, and then in such a way you can benefit the sentient beings. According to the teachings of the four Dharmas, it says that grant your blessings so that my mind may be one with the Dharma. May the Dharma progress along the path, and may the path clarify confusion, and may confusion dawn as wisdom. This is the teaching that is taught over here. As we can see that the Great Assembly had already eased their anxiety or doubts or confusion. But then maybe Ananda still has some confusion, because over here Ananda says that we have understood the meaning of the ending of the 6 and 1. Still, we have not yet gone through the fundamental perfect penetration. Now the question is about the perfect penetration senses. Ananda kept on asking questions. And Ananda continued to say that, world-honored one, we who have floated and floundered our way through aeons after aeons, homeless and orphaned, had no idea, we never imagined that we could meet with the Buddha in such a close relationship. He said that, look at us, the sentient beings had been drowning in the suffering of the ocean that is the samsara, and we've been floating in samsara and lost our ways for aeons after aeons without any help, without any refuge place, without any place to rely on. We're simply homeless and orphaned and had no idea that we could meet with the Buddha. Ananda had never thought that he could become a relative to the Buddha, to rely on the Buddha as his teacher, and to have such a long time in a discussion of Dharma with the Buddha. What a great opportunity. He couldn't even think about it in his dreams. And then he continued to say that we're like lost infants who have suddenly found their compassionate mother. It is just like a lost child that all of a sudden found the compassionate mother. This is just so wonderful. And then he continued to say that because of this, we accomplish the way in this assembly, yet the sacred words which we received are the same as our basic enlightenment, and so it is the same as if we hadn't even heard them. There are different explanations here, but over here it shows that we now have this opportunity to be gathered here to encounter in this Dharma assembly, and we have such a wonderful opportunity to attain realization. All of the sacred teachings, the sacred words, which we received are the same as our basic enlightenment. Over here it means that if the realization is still very much on the literal level, then it is as if one had never heard the actual teaching. This is one way of explaining this term. Another, where it says that if we only take these sacred words literally, or to keep them on a conceptual level but not to engage in actual practice, then it is not as a great value as it should be. It is not as meaningful. If we do not transform our mind stream, if we are still difficult to tame. Another explanation is that by relying on the sacred words, which can be a cause that leads to realization, because the teachings, the profound and the subtle teachings that's given by the Buddha today should become the secret teaching that lead one to rekindle the enlightened nature. Without such, then listening to Dharma teaching is just as if one had never even heard of it. The Tibetan translation is more of the later explanation. I noticed that the great masters' commentaries tend to be a little bit varied around this particular teaching here. But most of them points to that if we only understand the teachings only in words but not of its meanings, if we do not engage in actual practice of them, if we do not eradicate our afflictions, then other than planting a virtuous seed, there is no fundamental functions of it. This is really important. This particular teaching points to the later generations. At the times of receiving this teaching, one should have the mind of cherishing to receive those teachings, to save them in your notebook as well as in your mind, so that you can use it at all times. Then Ananda said that we only wish the great compassionate one will bestow upon us the profound secret as the thus come one's final instruction. Ananda over here supplicated to the great compassionate Buddha, saying that, would you please bestow us the secret and profound teachings as the final instructions. Ananda over here supplicated and then asked the Buddha to give instructions. But over here, it doesn't necessarily mean that the Buddha should give the teachings by himself, because in the later part, the teachings mostly are given by the disciples. With this kind of attitude, the Buddha supplicated, Ananda supplicated the Buddha and prostrated, withdrew, and held himself ready for the sacred opportunity as he waited for the Buddha's hidden transmission. According to the Great Master's commentary, it says that after prostrated, then he held him, then he withdrew himself. But in the Tibetan translation, it doesn't have the later part. It simply says that Ananda was waiting on the side. But according to the Chinese translation, it states that Ananda actually withdrew. And he held himself ready while concealing his expressions, while concealing his expectations, to wait for the secret transmission from the Buddha. He wishes for the Buddha to give some special transmission or hidden transmission, just as we would say that some of the teachings that's been passed down from the Tathagatas. Lots of the teachings, in fact, are not directly given by the Buddha, but given by the other great masters. But the benefits, indeed, are from the Buddhas, from the Tathagatas. So Ananda's particular attitude is that he did not specifically request that, oh, please, the Buddha, could you please give us the teachings on this and that? It is not like that at all. He rather said that, would the Buddha expound the teachings or give instructions? Would the Buddha give some hidden transmissions, waiting for the hidden transmissions? So this is his particular attitude, without really revealing his expectation. Rather, he awaited for the Buddha's transmissions, waiting for the opportunity. This is his attitude. And then the Buddha, the world-honored one, told all those in the assembly who were great bodhisattvas and great arhats, their outflow extinguished. All of you bodhisattvas and arhats who are born from within my dharma and have attained the stage beyond study, I now ask you, within the great assembly, there are humans and non-humans and mundane beings and heretics. There are great numbers of beings in that assembly. And then he told the great bodhisattvas, saying that those of the bodhisattvas who had already extinguished the afflictions, as well as the arhats, all of the elites of my students, saying that all of you bodhisattvas and arhats who are born from within my dharma and have attained the stages beyond study, I now ask you, when you first brought forth your resolve and became enlightened to the 18th realm, which one of these brought perfect penetration? Through which expedient did you enter samadhi? The Buddha then says that I'm going to give you a test. All of the 25 disciples, in the later part, all the 25 disciples will start to expound the 18 dhatus and the 7 great elements.
18的话呢，就是每一个都有一个通达的，就是然后那个
each of the 18 had penetrated the one of the dhatus, and then each of the 7 disciples had penetrated one of the 7 grades. In the later part, the 25 disciples will speak of how they had attained samadhi, how they attained realizations through the 18 dhatus, 18 realms, or the 7 grades. The Buddha did not ask what your realization is at the fruition ground. He did not say it in such a way, but he asked, how did you attain realization at the beginning? Which one of the 18 realms did you enter? Did you penetrate? And then in the later part, each of the 25 disciples will talk about their realizations. This is really well known within the Surangama Sutra. Let's see if we'll have our disciples over here attain realization, became the 26th disciple. We will cover it in our following classes. I think it should be easy to understand.